to The Security Affair, the flagship podcast of the Centre for International Security and Economic Strategy, or CISES, where we explore strategy, defence, economics and international security. I'm Alexander Anderson, Director of Policy at CISES. Today, we return with part 2 of our conversation on North Korean foreign policy and diplomacy with Fleur Boehm. If you haven't listened to part 1 yet, I'd recommend starting there for the full context, but you're very welcome to join us here as we continue the discussion. With us back again, Fleur, to continue our conversation from last time. We'll dive straight back into government's end policy. So what I wanted to ask you is how, if at all, the Russia-Ukraine war changed the prospects of normalization between the Koreas?
I think, if anything, North Korea's involvement in the conflict has definitely raised the North Korean issue as a security concern for South Korea. It's always been a concern, but just the mere fact that North Korea is being involved in foreign conflict, going as far as sending troops abroad, it has definitely raised the stakes of managing at least North Korea as a nuclear risk. Whether this can lead to normalization, I personally remain quite skeptical. I believe that Lee Jae-myung's recent end policy is a sort of, honestly, tacit recognition of North Korea, because the South Korean president has pledged to respect North Korea's territorial integrity and sovereignty. So we really have here a de facto recognition, so to say. But whether that would lead to legal and official normalization, I don't think it will. If anything, I think South Korea will probably lean more towards increased deterrence rather than normalization in this case.
Sorry, what I meant is how is the conflict a barrier to normalization? Because, for example, South Korea has also done intelligence sharing with Ukraine, so it's possible that there's some antagonism on both sides, not only North Korea, but North Korea has obviously been much more active in the conflict.
Yes. So I think, if anything, this creates a wider divide, so to say, in terms of we're kind of seeing the emergence of different blocs, so to say. And I think North Korea really being proactive in its support for Russia, and South Korea being, so to say, on the other side, supporting Ukraine, I do think it creates a wider divide, simply because North Korea is kind of becoming integrated within another alliance, with Russia in this case, and South Korea is also trying to deepen its involvement in its own trilateral alliance with the United States and Japan, and in general its broader alignment with the West. So I do believe that North Korea becoming, so to say, more of an international actor is going to be another issue, because now the talking points are not merely the North Korean nuclear program, so to say, but they're also North Korea's kind of supporting of international conflict. So I think that will definitely be more of an obstacle.
Okay, thank you for that reply. Crossing the Pacific, in some senses, President Lee recently met, a few weeks ago now, met President Trump at the APEC summit to discuss North Korea. That was one of, at least, the issues mentioned. Is détente between the Koreas possible under this US administration? I think we talked a bit about on Trump's second administration how that can impact the region.
So I think first we had Lee Jae-myung's announcement of the end policy at the United Nations, where he called for broader international support. But this was a different scenario, because South Korea was meeting with the United States one-on-one, so to say, on the sidelines of the APEC meeting. And I think what we've seen in terms of Lee's policy decisions, or at least his pledges, vary slightly from his announced policy. For instance, when Lee was talking with Trump, there was an announcement that South Korea would raise its defense budget to 3.5% of the GDP, which Trump welcomes, because there has been a similar demand for Japan, and Japan also announced a raise of its defense spending. So I think we're definitely seeing some sort of rapprochement with the between the United States and South Korea. Whether that can lead to détente between the two Koreas is still unsure, because there have been pledges and sort of the two countries, being the United States and South Korea, reaffirming their commitment to increasing deterrence, nuclear sharing, these sort of things. So I think, if anything, this will not really alter the status quo at the moment. If anything, there have not really been any talks, as far as I'm aware, to directly engage North Korea to come to the negotiating table, but rather implementing the 2018 agreement, and still a focus on denuclearization, which seems to be Lee sort of amending his original policy to get the United States on board, at least is my understanding. So I don't think we will see a lot of progress right now, at least in terms of the two nations. Yeah.
So, building upon Trump's contemporary influence in both South Korea and in the last part in Japan, what would you say, maybe more broadly, is the US's role in how North Korea builds its relationships? Obviously, it's a constraining factor, but is there something more specific, maybe?
I think the US is central to North Korean foreign policy. In fact, it's central to all North Korean politics. It's the center of the personality cult, it's the center of its foreign policy formulation, so it really is an important element. I believe whether North Korea is trying to engage the United States or antagonize the United States at different points, the United States are always an important element. So I think, if anything, the United States have sort of dictated North Korea's choices in what countries to sort of engage with. Countries that might not be, well, according to my research, countries like maybe Indonesia, Vietnam, India, that are not so completely aligned with the United States, trying to gain a diplomatic leverage. And I think because for the North Korean regime, the United States are the number one security concern, there's always, all the foreign policy decisions are sort of enacted to aim at least to counter growing US presence and influence in the region, because the number one thing that North Korea views as a threat to its physical security are, for example, the joint military exercises between the United States and South Korea. So all of its foreign policy decisions they're often reactionary to what the United States are doing in the region. So it's definitely a central factor. So if there is to be growing sort of military deterrence in the region, we can definitely expect a reaction from the DPRK.
Okay. Zooming out more into the maybe more abstract, could you explain why understanding North Korea as an active diplomatic actor, as a part of the international community, rather than a mere spectator who's often just dependent on Russia, China, and the United States, might help both the public and policymakers in approaching?
I think there are several layers to this. I think more broadly, it's crucial to understand how North Korea functions as a regime, merely for the sake of controlling the nuclear risk. I think it tells us a lot about how this nation is able to sustain its nuclear program, how it's attempting to legitimize it, and I think that's really crucial, just in terms of the nuclear world order, first of all. Second of all, I think if we want to be able to manage this nuclear risk, it's really crucial to understand the different layers of North Korea's strategy, because otherwise certain mechanisms might be obscured. So I think that's also an important thing. And in terms of more practically, I think there has to be an understanding now within politics that when it comes to North Korea, it might be interesting to engage other nations that, for example, India or Indonesia, Vietnam. I mean, these nations have, or for example, Singapore and Vietnam have hosted bilateral summits, but they could potentially play a more active role, actually, in, opening up dialogue with North Korea. I'm not suggesting another six-party talk situation, but it might be interesting to gather more countries that are, so to say, not completely hostile to the DPRK in order to really create meaningful dialogue rather than always, because repeating the same strategy, no matter how many times, is unlikely to lead to a different outcome. So I think really understanding North Korea's somewhat dynamic and active foreign policy, it might be able to lead to new strategies in simply engaging North Korea.
So you've already partially answered the next question, which was, would you say that your findings and these partnerships suggest a shift in how we should approach security on the Korean Peninsula? So besides engaging these countries with whom North Korea has various levels of partnerships, what shift do you think?
I think this should lead to a broader reassessment of sanctions in general, seeing what impact sanctions have actually had and what progress they have generated, because in truth it is little. So I think it could be a shift in not just ways in which we could engage North Korea, it's just a shift in broader DPRK policy. Because the policies so far, at least in the West, they have not worked. They have not. And to think that maybe if certain Western nations would be more open to aligning with Southeast Asian nations or South Asian nations or how they manage the North Korean problem, it might lead to innovation in DPRK policy, because at the moment we really are at a diplomatic stalemate, so to say, where the situation is not changing and we keep trying to use the same mechanisms. So I think that's one aspect of it, definitely.
Okay. I think you've already answered this perfectly in sort of building partnerships with other nations, etc. But if you could advise a policymaker in Seoul or Tokyo, based on your research, what would you tell them about engaging with North Korea?
I think actually the number one takeaway in this case would probably be respect. I think that there's such a personality cult in North Korea, evidently, and the leader is not only the head of state, it's the domestic identity. So I think this is really important in obviously North Korean propaganda, but it's also an important theme when North Korean media reports on events abroad. So I think in engaging North Korea, it is really important to drop this narrative of the evil regime, and it has truth. I mean, the humanitarian situation is deplorable. That is true, but I think that there really is a necessity to engage North Korea as a respectable country in a sense, because otherwise no progress will be made. That's sort of a requirement. So I think yes, it's very important for policymakers to learn to engage North Korea as a normal state, so to say.
I just got a question. When you say to what extent can we separate human rights? Because we do so in several relationships across the world where we separate human rights from security. But in North Korea's case, to what extent can we do that?
I'm not going to argue for a complete separation, because it is true that the humanitarian situation is absolutely deplorable and the treatment of North Korean defectors varies widely worldwide. But I think showing respect to the North Korean leadership as a normal state might bridge a broader conversation on the North Korean regime. Whether that will lead to true political change is truly unlikely. But I don't believe that addressing North Korea as basically just a normal state renders the humanitarian issue. It won't sideline it. It's still an issue. And I believe that there are other countries around the world that have really poor human rights records that we still engage in a normal way. So it's not really about separating the issue. It's about recognizing the reality, but still wanting to sort of diplomatically make progress. I think that's the only way to make progress on all fronts of North Korean politics.
Okay, thank you. What would you say are the three main takeaways you'd like to leave our listeners with?
So the first one would be that North Korea is not a rogue state. That would be or pariah state in a way. That North Korea has legitimate security concerns. It reacts to it maybe differently to what other nations do. But it is not a rogue state. My second takeaway would be that North Korean foreign policy has changed, is dynamic, and has evolved over the years. It's not static politically. North Korea is not a diplomatically static country, even though there has been no regime change, so to say. The policy has evolved with time. And my last takeaway, perhaps a bit more obvious, is the importance to look beyond, so say, the security triangle. Look at North Korean foreign policy beyond the scope of Japan, the United States, and China, and the importance of doing so in building an accurate picture of North Korean diplomacy overall. So that would be my three main points.
Okay, great. If you could summarize North Korea's diplomatic strategy in one sentence, what would it be? It's a pretty hard one.
It's hard, but I would probably say that North Korea engaged in selective strategic engagement. I want to compliment this just by saying that North Korea's ultimate priority, in my eyes, is probably more constructivist leaning. North Korea's main priority is status and how it's perceived internationally. So that leads to its selective engagement with nations that would provide it with status benefits, really. Yeah.
Okay. And finally, Fleur, could you recommend 2 to 3 readings, resources, or podcasts for listeners who want to explore this diplomatic perspective on North Korea?
Yes, so 100%. I would probably recommend a book that I've used a lot in my research would be a book by Scott Snyder that came out in 2022 or 2023, I believe, which is about, I believe it's titled North Korea's Foreign Policy, the Kim Jong-un in a Hostile World. So it basically retraces the Kim Jong-un years, so since 2012, and showing how North Korean foreign policy has changed. So we have phases of diplomatic charm, how they call it, where Kim Jong-un engages with the United States, and then we have more offensive measures, economic measures. It really retraces a wide scope of North Korean politics. So I think that's a very interesting source. Another book I'd recommend would be, it's the book that I mentioned earlier that came out this year called Southeast Asia North Korea Relations. It's a very simple title. And the undertitle is Drivers, Linkages, and Strategic Ambivalence. And I think it's very interesting because it goes country by country in Southeast Asia and details what the historic relations have been like and what they are like today. So, for example, nations that I've not spent a lot of time looking at, like Cambodia. So I think this is very important. That's definitely a source I'd recommend. If wanting to know more about the humanitarian aspect, which I discussed less, but I think is very telling, would be probably a documentary called Beyond Utopia, which I believe came out a few years ago. So it retraces the history of 3 families defecting North Korea, and it really showcases the politics of defection. So, for instance, families who cannot go to China because they will be returned back to North Korea. So it really kind of, through the humanitarian aspect, showcases what diplomatic allies, so to say, North Korea has. So I think that's interesting because it goes beyond China. It talks about Laos, etc. So I think that would be my last source that I'd recommend, although it's a harrowing watch, really.
Okay, great. Thank you, Fleur, for your time with us today.
Yes, thank you so much.
Joining us for this 2-part conversation on North Korean diplomacy. We'll be back on Friday with a new episode where we'll explore the role of information in modern warfare and contemporary societies. This has been The Security Affair, the Centre for International Security and Economic Strategies podcast, unpacking the ideas, events, and decisions shaping strategy, defence, economics and international security. I'm Alexander Anderson, and our guest has been Fleur Boehm. See you next time.